I have spent months pondering the question, is the signal void incident related to Perseverance Mills? I have written script after script, revising what I at one point thought was impossible. In my opinion, there is a connection between signal void and Perseverance Mills. It might not be obvious and it might seem impossible, but I have speculated how it all fits together. Of course, there will be heavy spoilers for both Signal Void and Wintermute. Before I begin, please don't forget to comment, like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Since this video is so long, expect to hear some inconsistencies with my voiceover as I'm recording it over multiple days. To make this video as short and concise as possible, this is a list of the different sections of the theory I will be covering. You can use the chapters listed in the description to go back to a previous chapter if you need to. If you played through or watched videos on Signal Void, you should have a fair understanding of what exactly happened. If you didn't, I would highly recommend you either finish the tale or watch my overview video about it, which I will link in the top right of the screen, in the description of the video, and at the very end of the video. Otherwise, this is what you need to know about the Signal Void tale. A team of researchers arrived on Great Bear Island and traveled to the far territory to start a secret project in the Langston mine. A machine was built as the core of the project. Rudiger was the lead for the project and was the only person that knew what the machine was doing. Eventually, an outbreak occurs, and this is what happens. Various rounds of interviews are conducted on the researchers to monitor their dreams and mental state. The machine is eventually turned off, and Rudiger leaves shortly after. Rudiger is the only member of the research team that never showed a symptom of the outbreak. An extraction is planned to help the researchers off the island. The symptoms, as well as the relative order of events of the Signal Void outbreak, are insomnia, which caused recurring dreams that would become nightmares over time, mental decline and memory loss, sleepwalking that resulted in patients being locked away. The core aspects of the Signal Void outbreak are entirely related to the brain and sleeping, which will be very important for this video. I do need to mention that AtFar 11 pointed out something important to me. They brought to my attention that the glimmer fog and the insomnia it causes may be related to the machine. The consensus is that the machine was emitting an energy field which would affect the researchers. If this was true, it is possible the machine was electrifying the atmosphere, creating the glimmer fog. This would mean the machine is still active somewhere in the far territory. Insomnia is a possible symptom of the Signal Void outbreak, and this would explain why glimmer fog is only seen in the far territory. The machine would be powered by the Aurora events and would later release the energy as the glimmer fog during the day. This section is rather long because we know considerably less about the Perseverance Mills outbreak than we do about the Signal Void outbreak. We only know that there are multiple infected individuals in Perseverance Mills and a quarantine was enacted. The only physical symptom we know of is shown in the final cutscene for Wintermute episode 4. This cutscene shows Astrid, an unknown female, and two unknown males. The symptom is seen in the eyes of the unknown males. They are clearly sick, and their darker eyes compared to the eyes of the unknown female are a sign of sleep deprivation. Most likely they are suffering from insomnia. The face coverings may be a clue as to the nature of the outbreak being viral or bacterial, but I believe that these people may be doing it instinctively being in a quarantine zone. The female not wearing one shows she is not infected. It might also be a way to hide something very important that Hinterland did not want us to see quite yet. If you recall, it is revealed in episode 3 that Astrid used to work for the Seraphim Sleep Research Center. Before the start of the game, she has a conversation with the unknown female from the end of episode 4. This conversation revealed 3 key details. Astrid and Seraphim have been working on the cure for the Perseverance Mills outbreak. Astrid knows the outbreak and its consequences well enough that she may be partially or fully responsible for it. One victim of the outbreak had an episode of some kind that put them in danger, and it may happen again. The line, "I'm afraid it's happening again, I'm afraid we'll lose her this time," could refer to anything, but the part where she says, "it's happening again," is very important. I believe it is referring to sleepwalking, which is a recurring condition. I can back that claim up once I fully explain the conversation at the end of episode 4. This conversation is long, but very important to understand the Perseverance Mills outbreak. The conversation revealed 2 key details. Despite the quarantine, there are quarantine breakers, and the quarantine breakers are washing ashore from the water after drowning. At this point, these people are used to seeing drowned quarantine breakers wash ashore, which means it is a common occurrence. Based on the environment of Great Bear Island, it is safe to assume that any sane-minded individual would absolutely never go far from the safety of their home without survival gear. The reason I say this is because it is very clear that people are leaving their homes and wandering away from the town. Earlier, I had mentioned that sleepwalking might be a symptom of the Perseverance Mills outbreak, and I think this conversation proves it. If the victims of this outbreak are suffering from insomnia and sleepwalking incidents, then it is possible that some of these people are wandering from their homes and getting lost in the wilderness of Great Bear Island. I imagine some of them are walking across ice along the coastline and then suddenly falling through, drowning in the cold sea and washing ashore at a later time. It may even be possible that these people are suffering mental decline, but there is no physical or dialogue-based evidence that supports that. As of now, it seems like the symptoms of the Perseverance Mills outbreak are insomnia and sleepwalking. With the knowledge we have about the two outbreaks, it is very clear that both of them are in fact related to the brain and sleeping. Honestly, I have no idea what exactly the signal void outbreak really is. A lot of people will point to the machine and say it was mind control. I've had people tell me that it might be an MK Ultra-like experiment, an ancient prion, or even something similar to Mass Effect's indoctrination theory. I've also speculated that it could be a metaphorical switch in the brain that was flipped and caused an irreversible breakdown of the brain. The machine certainly has a purpose that we don't know of yet. I think it is just as likely for the outbreak to be caused by the machine as it is by a pathogen created in a lab. While the security chief mentions that it is not a known pathogen, it is still possible that it could be a pathogen that is unknown to everyone except the people that made it. Assuming they are connected to this, I think Seraphim could be the equivalent of Umbrella from the Resident Evil franchise. As for the machine itself, it is possible it played a hand in how the pathogen behaved or functioned. Rudiger to me was incredibly suspicious for many reasons. He was the only one to know what the machine was doing, he never showed a symptom like every other researcher, and left as soon as the machine was shut off. I think it is entirely possible that Rudiger had an extra objective that the rest of the researchers didn't know. At this point, we are entering a sci-fi horror scenario. We don't really know the true nature of the outbreak itself and whether it's naturally induced, mechanically induced, or both. The true nature of the outbreak makes me question whether the dreams and nightmares were a true symptom. I'm willing to bet Rudiger had a hand in starting the outbreak and collecting the data. This section is very short because I kind of already explained it in a previous video about Port Mary, a port town for Great Bear Island. If you want the full explanation, you can watch that video, which I will link in the top right of the screen, in the description of the video, and at the very end of the video. Using the in-game lore and dialogue, we know that Perseverance Mills and Port Mary are on the Great Bear Highway, and they are on the north end of the island. The north end of the island is actually over here because the world map is oriented the wrong way. This is the approximate correct orientation of the island, leaving this section just off the map to be one of the only possible places for Perseverance Mills to be at. For the Signal Void project, we know it took place in the Langston Mine in the Far Territory, which is in the south end of the island. I've seen a few people mention the timing of the Signal Void outbreak to be far in the past, but I believe it took place relatively recently in terms of the history of the Long Dark. You may be pointing at the bunkers used to hide the Signal Void project logs and the data technology used to make them, but there is a fairly simple explanation for this. First, I'll explain it in the case the bunkers are really old and were repurposed later for the Signal Void project. Theoretically, in a world where both world wars occurred, it is highly likely the Cold War also occurred. My best guess is that these bunkers were Cold War safe houses. I don't think anyone would bother to nuke a tiny remote island in northern Canada, nor do I think these bunkers would survive the blast. In reality, they could have been built to protect survivors from the nuclear fallout and possible nuclear winter. Second, I'll explain it in the case the bunkers are brand new and were built for the Signal Void project. The Long Dark has one important characteristic about it that we need to remember. This game and its universe is time agnostic. This means there is no certainty when the Long Dark takes place, both in terms of time period and technology. The game references things like electric vehicles, drone delivery services, and solar power units. The game also shows a cell phone at the very beginning on Will's desk. Great Bear Island is so incredibly lost in time that you can't really tell what decade it is. Even though I pinpointed the approximate year of the first flare being 2022, it doesn't mean that the world in the Long Dark is exactly like ours. An example of this that I know of is the animated show Archer, with the characters referencing prohibition, segregation, both world wars, the Cold War, satellites, space stations, cyborgs, the internet, cell phones, and social media. The show Archer is time agnostic, just like the Long Dark. Therefore, it is also likely that the bunkers and the tech to make them were as modern as possible. Personally, I believe the bunkers were built for the Signal Void project. Now, let me examine the tale itself to determine when exactly did the outbreak occur. Based on the earliest log left by the security chief of the Signal Void project, the project took place after the collapse. The reason is because the security chief mentions the people of Great Bear Island and a specific characteristic that did not exist until after the collapse. That characteristic is a general hatred of outsiders. The collapse brought an end to Great Bear Island's prosperity, leaving it to be abandoned by the rest of Canada. This would create resentment against mainlanders and outsiders in general by the islanders. This explains why the character of the locals and their tendency to ignore or refuse to help outsiders served in favor of the research team. This helped them camouflage their presence and their work on the island. In conclusion, the Signal Void experiment and outbreak took place after the collapse. Personally, I believe it took place not long before the Perseverance Mills quarantine was enacted. For the Perseverance Mills outbreak, we know that Astrid was working on the cure to the mysterious illness plaguing the town. From this, it would make sense that the outbreak and subsequent quarantine would have started just before the first flare. Based on what we know from the tale, the Signal Void outbreak took place in the Langston mine in the Far Territory. The tale also offers hints about the start of the experiment. The security chief mentions that the researchers and the equipment needed for the experiment came from the coast. I have long speculated that Port Mary is where the researchers arrived on Great Bear Island. The in-game lore makes Port Mary sound like a central hub for importing and exporting goods, as well as a place where people could ferry over from the mainland. Even if Port Mary was the starting and ending point for the research team's journey, and even though Port Mary and Perseverance Mills are relatively close to each other, I still don't know if both instances of the outbreak are exactly the same. By that I mean I don't think the Perseverance Mills outbreak's origin is from an infected researcher. It is possible some kind of contamination event occurred where someone from the island got sick and spread the disease, but I honestly don't think that is the case. While Port Mary was essential for the islanders, and it most likely still had a lot of visitors from all over the island, the chances of someone from Perseverance Mills running into an infected researcher and catching the disease is so incredibly low. Instead, I believe that Perseverance Mills was the subject of a completely different but related experiment. There is one key detail about Signal Void that may explain why this might be the case. While playing through Signal Void, you can see the world map and how each transmitter covers vast sections of the island. If you recall, the note that came with the handheld radio mentioned signal interference coming from specific locations. The interference turned out to be the bunkers that held secret information about the experiment. Someone had to put it there and jam the local transmitters in the process. Without these transmitters, it would be incredibly difficult to communicate that there is an emergency such as a disease outbreak. I admit this is where I'm starting to sound like a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, but there is more evidence that these outbreak events are completely separate with a common origin than there is for a cross-contamination scenario. The handheld note mentioning the signal interference means these bunkers were all set up before the first flare. Additionally, the transmitters would undergo yearly maintenance, meaning the interference had to be recent. Another important thing to note is that during our time in Wintermute, there is not a single islander that mentions the outbreak at Perseverance Mills. Something that serious would need to be communicated with the public, but it was clear it never was. This is my condensed theory for this video. Seraphim is 100% responsible for these outbreak events. The Signal Void experiment would allow for a discrete contamination event to occur without anyone knowing it. Everyone except for Rudiger would eventually get sick. Once this experiment wrapped up, the researchers left, leaving behind the machine. Someone, I suspect Rudiger, would take the various experiment logs and other evidence and would prepare to bury it. Seraphim conducts another experiment on the remote, completely forgotten town of Perseverance Mills. This time, since the experiment took place in a public place, they enact a quarantine and promise a cure. Astrid, working at Seraphim, would come into contact with a resident in Perseverance Mills and would begin the process of stealing the cure and bring it to the town. With most of the transmitters being jammed by the bunkers, Rudiger's job was done. The island would have a difficult time communicating what was happening, therefore keeping most people outside of Perseverance Mills in the dark on what was going on. Does this theory have any implications for Wintermute? Honestly, I don't know. As stated by Hinterland, the tales are not meant to have a huge impact on Wintermute's finale, but may connect to them in some way. I think it is entirely possible that whatever connection the tales have with Wintermute, whether it is a connection between the two outbreaks or not, it is something only we the player will know. Will and Astrid may never know. The victims at Perseverance Mills may never know. It is up to us to put the pieces of the puzzle together and make the connections that make the most sense. In reality, the purpose of the tales is to expand the overall story of the game without having to extend it. It is us that will know and understand what happened, and that is intentional. I really hope that everything I said in this video makes sense and I covered everything. I would not be surprised if I made some mistakes or omissions that are important. If I did, please let me know. I will pin a comment with any corrections or clarifications if it is necessary. This video has been months in the making, and that is why I'm glad the second tale was delayed. I'm hoping that timing this video's release just before the release of the second tale will help create some conversation around this idea and what it means for Wintermute and the expansion. Since I finished this script a long time ago, Buried Echoes was revealed to be the name of the second tale and fourth expansion update. Hinterland has already mentioned that this tale will go in an unexpected direction and features the research team, the security chief, and Rudiger. I hope that Buried Echoes can prove me right or wrong. Either way, this video will still have been worth the work. I do apologize that the final third of this video sounds a little weird because I did catch COVID, unfortunately. I would absolutely love to make more videos like this in the future, but I need your help. In order to get this video out to more people, you need to leave a like and a comment, as well as watch the whole thing to help the video's analytics. Subscribing and hitting the notification bell also helps as well. If you are able to financially support the channel, you can become a member today. If not, that is entirely okay. Shout out to my current members.